Felly, ia, croeso mawr I chi. Rhys Evans, dwi'n gweithio i'r rhwydwaith ffermio a lles natur yn Cymru. A da ni yn grŵp o ffermwyr sydd wedi dod at ei gilydd i hyrwyddo ac i reoli dros ffermio sy'n dda yn gwrchledd ac yn gyfnaws efo bywyd gwyllt. So, yeah, my name's Rhys Evans. I'm the Sustainable Farming Lead for the Nature Friendly Farming Network Cymru. We're a network of farmers who have come together to champion away farming for sustainable and good for nature. So I'll be chairing this update session. We'll be hearing from James Owen, the Deputy Director of Land Management at the Welsh Government, who will be giving us just a short update on the future of food and farming policies in Wales. There'll be 10 or 15 minutes at the end after the update to ask questions. So if you have any questions, please use the chat function to submit them. But just to set some context, there's no doubt that food and farming is at a crossroads in Wales. We've got a clean slate in terms of designing a new domestic agricultural policy to replace a common agricultural policy. We've got a community food strategy that was included in the Welsh Labour Senedd manifesto, and recently the Senedd voted in favour of introducing a Welsh food bill. But at the same time, we're facing a nature and a climate crisis, farmers suffering from diminishing returns for their produce, the potential threats of international trade deals, potentially undermining our domestic producers, as well as the challenges brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it's safe to say there are numerous opportunities out there to help shape the future of food and farming in Wales, but many challenges and concerns that need addressing as well. So on that note, I'll hand over to James, who will give us an insight into the Welsh Government's thinking on the future of food and farming in Wales. Okay, diolch yn fawr, and over to you, James. We can't hear you, James. Well, I can't hear you anyway, and you're not on mute. Am I the only one who can't hear you?
Okay, how's that? Is that better?
That's better now, that's all right.
There we go. We'll dispense with the headphones. Well, diolch yn fawr, Rhys, and apologies for the technical issues. Great to be back at the conference, 2 years on from attending in person in Aberystwyth, and a chance to give you a little update before taking some questions on Welsh Government policy in this area. Rhys set out the context beautifully, so I perhaps won't reiterate the points. I think what I will probably just do in the next 10 minutes or so is just set out a bit about where the government are, some of our priorities, and how we want to involve farmers and everyone with an interest in future farming policy, land management, food production, and all the other sectors of our rural community in a kind of ongoing discussion as we continue to develop our policy. So I think that probably the first thing to say is the Minister set out in a really helpful statement back in September where the government were in terms of our proposed sustainable farming scheme. So if you haven't had a chance to read that and see in some detail where we are, I'd commend that to you. I think it was a really good positional statement to set out the new government's agenda, if you like, around what it intends to do during the course of this Senedd term. In essence, it committed us to introducing an agriculture bill into the Senedd in the first year of this Senedd term. So that will be in advance of summer recess in 2022. So we intend to introduce the bill into the Senedd next calendar year before the summer recess. And that bill will build on the proposals that we set out in the free consultations we've undertaken to date, and most recently around an agriculture white paper, which set out a broad range of proposals, but with a strong focus on an overall framework of sustainable land management being the priority for future agricultural policy in Wales. Well, what does that mean in principle? Well, it's about thinking about how we best use our resources, land, water, etc., to derive effectively environmental outcomes alongside the production, the sustainable production of food. And why have we gone for sustainable land management as being our priority? Well, because we think it's vitally important that we look at the economic, social and environmental aspects of agriculture policy as we develop it in a post-Brexit world. In the white paper, we also set out our proposals, as Rhys said, to replace the current EU-based Common Agricultural Payment Support Schemes. So that those are the Basic Payment Scheme and the Glass-Steer programmes that I know a number of you may be familiar with, and replace it with a sustainable farming scheme, a whole farm scheme, which looks at sustainable food production and tackling the priorities of the government in relation to the climate and nature emergencies in a hand-in-glove way. And I think it's important to state there that, you know, for us, you know, we recognise that to deliver the sustainability requirements that, you know, that we have through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, it's vitally important that we do look at the economic and social aspects of farming alongside the environmental benefits that we know it can deliver. So we've advocated an approach which looks at all three of those priorities, and we propose, as I say, a scheme which looks to reward farmers for the actions they undertake to deliver a certain range of environmental outcomes. Now, I don't think any of those will be a surprise to people on this call. Outcomes such as clean air, clean water, carbon sequestration, as well as actually reducing emissions, recycling where we can, and reducing waste into the system. So policies long advocated by the government, and a real opportunity through the proposed scheme to shape actually future support for farmers to deliver against those priorities alongside the sustainable production of food. Just a little bit more about, so where are we in terms of our policy development? Well, the Minister committed in September to publishing alongside the Agriculture Bill a outline of the proposed scheme. So as I mentioned, we've consulted on this a couple of times, but actually there's, you know, rightly we get questioned about the detail of what's going to be in the scheme and what are the payment rates going to be looking like. Well, we've committed to publishing an outline of the scheme alongside the Agriculture Bill, not least to help colleagues in the Senate as part of the effective scrutiny of the bill, but also to start another round of engagement with stakeholders and farmers and those with an interest in how that scheme will look in terms of the detail. So once we've introduced the bill, we intend to run a second set of what we've called co-design, which is a process that was really successful last year in engaging around 2,000 farmers in a discussion really on what that scheme should look like, and giving people an opportunity to shape it in a way that works for Welsh farmers and that can deliver the triple outcomes that we're seeking around food production, around responding to the climate and nature emergencies. So once we've introduced the bill and published the draft scheme, we will also then move into a process of co-design. I think the other thing that I mentioned that we've committed to publishing alongside the bill is our regulatory impact assessment. That's a really important piece of work for us because it demonstrates the evidence, really, if you like, behind our proposals and how we can link payments to farmers to the environmental outcomes that they deliver. And that's really important, I think, on a number of levels, not least because, you know, there will be an increasing level of scrutiny, no doubt, in how the public sector and public money is supporting farmers in the future to deliver the social outcomes that we're talking about here, such as clean water, clean air, etc. So alongside the bill, alongside the scheme, we'll also be publishing our impact assessment, our evidence base, if you like, of why we've designed the scheme in the way that we have. And really, you know, that will give us an opportunity, I think, to have a really rich discussion on the detail of the scheme itself with farmers, and of course enable the Senate to do scrutinise effectively the proposals that we put forward in the Agriculture Bill. Just kind of turning to the overall timeline for government now. So we've long talked about having a managed and phased transition into the proposed scheme, and we think that's really important because you know, for two reasons. This is you know, we only get one real opportunity to get this right, and so doing it in a managed and considered way to bring farmers along with us, to change the dynamic, if you like, between the current subsidy-based payments into something like a sustainable farming scheme, which is looking at all actions on a holistic whole farm scale, is going to be some transition. So we want to take farmers with us. So from a timeline perspective, what we've committed to do is, subject to the Senate giving royal assent to the bill, we would seek to consult on our final proposals for the scheme in 2023. We then start a process of outreach where we look to sign farmers up to the scheme in 24 with a view to the first contracts going live in 25. We've also committed to consulting then on how on the process then of transitioning farmers from from the current schemes that they're in into the sustainable farming scheme over a multi-year period. So there will be more chance for engagement and discussion on that. I think the really important thing for me here is that we get the support right for farmers. We get the support right both in terms of the payment they can expect to receive in exchange, as I say, for the environmental outcomes they deliver, but also the support in terms of the knowledge transfer, innovation and advice that is available to farmers, enable them to maintain a productive and resilient farm business alongside the changes to the subsidy regime. So that's a bit about our kind of overall timeline. Just to say maybe just a little bit about the proposed scheme itself. We've talked about farmers delivering actions or taking actions on their farm to deliver, which by proxy will deliver outcomes, environmental outcomes. So what we're doing at the moment is working to design those actions. We're using a very comprehensive set of work that's been supported by Bangor University, amongst others, to develop the evidence base for those actions, so that we can effectively base payment rates which go beyond costs incurred and income foregone, but recognise the true societal benefit of the outcomes we're seeking. And how we're shaping that, and how we're shaping the scheme around that, is a set of universal actions which we'd expect most farms to be able to undertake, which will deliver a certain set of outcomes. A set of optional actions which farmers and farm businesses could undertake due to the nature of their farming practice, or due to the appetite, if you like, to undertake some of these optional things, or indeed due to the nature of the land that they farm. And then a set of collaborative actions where we'd look at, I think, at a landscape scale to really maximise some of the benefits of the approaches that we're advocating at a larger scale, and to reward farmers effectively for delivering on those. So still in the process of scheme design. As I say, expect to hear more on that next year when we publish the outline scheme. And I guess the last thing before I hand over to questions is just to really encourage those of you on the call who have an interest in this, is to register for our co-design process. As I say, we had 2,000 farmers involved last year. We'd love to have even more farmers involved next year when we talk about the scheme and what it means. And it gives a real opportunity, I think, to shape the government's proposals in this area. And for those of you who are going, we'll be at the Winter Fair next week, actively having a conversation around co-design and signing people up. So it'd be lovely if you are at the Winter Fair, you come and say hello, and perhaps agree to help us as we continue the journey towards a sustainable farming scheme of the future. Diolch, so I'll probably turn to questions now to give plenty of time for people to ask anything they want to. Really.
Diolch, James, for that update. Couple of questions that came in beforehand, so I'll start with some of those. There are many farmers out there currently who are not enrolled in any agri-environment schemes, and would love to do more for nature and climate, and take advantage of such schemes. However, many of them can't access schemes currently, and are therefore suffering from a potentially large income gap as well. So what support can Welsh Government offer these farmers kind of between now and the launch of the sustainable farming scheme in the interim?
Okay, so I think that probably just to unpack the two questions there, I mean, I think there is a question around eligibility for the future scheme, and I think it came up in a previous conversation as well. I mean, we think that's one of the topics we need to explore in our co-design that I mentioned, about how we get that right. There are currently around 16,000 farm businesses in Wales that are receiving a payment under the basic payment scheme. And I think there are something like 2,000 glass-steer contracts. So, there is a large section of farmers there, but obviously I'm aware that that is, only 2/3 of the farm businesses in Wales that are currently receiving that subsidy support. So I think as we design a scheme of the future, eligibility for that scheme is really important, and I'd encourage everyone to get involved in the discussion when we publish our proposals next year. In terms of the interim, perhaps not the greatest of news for those on the call who are currently not eligible. The eligibility criteria that we've set out in the basic payment scheme, we have no proposals at the moment to change those. And whilst we've confirmed an extension to glass-steer contracts until the end of 2023, at the moment there isn't a proposal to extend the scope of those schemes to new entrants. However, having said that, what we have committed to is a series of pilot programs over the next 2 years as we look to transition to the new scheme. So what we'd like to do is to showcase some of the interventions in the new scheme, and to try them out in different farms in different ways, to really just develop some of the evidence base around the future scheme, and that perhaps will involve and can involve, farmers who are not currently eligible for the existing schemes. So more on that to follow. We're awaiting, obviously, the Welsh Government budgets discussions and that being approved with the Senate before we can launch our pilot and prepare programme, which is around, I think, that transition. But there may well be opportunities for those who are not currently in schemes to get involved through that avenue.
And in the Welsh Government's net zero plan, there was a reference to a potential sort of organic farming transition scheme as well. Is that something that you're kind of going to co-design as well, or do you have plans for that, and who would be able to access that support?
Yeah, so I'm not familiar on the eligibility for that support, but it is part of our Net Zero Wales plan, as you mentioned, Rhys. Again, what we see the next couple of years being is an effective way to start that transition to the sustainable farming scheme. So the minister's always been clear about not having a cliff edge here, so that we're not just going to turn one scheme off and turn another scheme on. We need to transition over a period of time, and we think over the next couple of years, the ability to pilot various initiatives such as organics or extend the range of our current schemes is going to be really important to help farmers on that transition. So as I say, we've got a bit more work to do on that in government first, and of course we need to have the budget agreed for next financial year by through the Senate processes. But the intention is throughout 2022 and throughout 2023, as we do that transition, is to start turning or making opportunities available for farmers to get involved and to draw down government support in that way. More generally, of course, Farming Connect still is in operation, and those farmers who are interested in organic conversion can obviously pick up the phone and speak to advisors from Farming Connect about the support already available from government to do that.
We've got a political question here from Shay Buckland-Jones. Shay would be interested to know your views on how the Labour-Plaid agreement will impact the design of the Sustainable Farming Scheme and how funding is targeted in this scheme in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. A great question for a humble civil servant here. So, I think obviously the cooperation agreement is new. We in the government, in the civil service part of the government, if that makes sense, need to work through the detail of what that means in terms of future policy. It's an agreement between two political parties that we need to understand the mechanisms for working through that agreement. I think, though, the point that I would probably make there is that we've talked for a number of years about having a transition into the sustainable farm scheme. I've mentioned no cliff edge already. I think it's really important that those kind of principles, in our whatever policy approach finally comes out of that agreement, are maintained. And I know, I know that the cooperation agreement also talks about the long-term sustainability of family farms and local sustainable food production. And I think there's an opportunity there to bring those into the kind of equation of developing a community food strategy, and obviously the food bill that was agreed to be introduced in the Senate next week. So I think there's an opportunity there as well as a potential challenge. But if I'm honest, it's a little bit early for us to be commenting on it. We need to understand how ministers and how Plaid Cymru have agreed to work through that agreement before we can really give a clear steer to everybody on what that will mean from a policy perspective.
There's a couple of questions on the kind of wider food system. So yeah, is the Welsh Government concentrating enough, do you think, on developing that sort of food systems approach to food policy? Was that sort of the high level ambition in the white paper for many is welcome. They don't address the wider issues in terms of diminishing returns for on-farm produce, supply chain issues, and sort of reliance on export markets, etc. So, are you talking to your sort of food colleagues at Welsh Government how both the food bill and an agri bill can go hand in hand?
Yeah, a good question. I think, firstly, of course, there's a programme for government commitment to introduce a community food strategy, which my colleagues who I work closely alongside. We're all part of the same directorate within the Welsh Government, the farming and food sector, so who are working on that at the moment, and of course that features in the cooperation agreement and as I mentioned the members bill that was introduced as well. So I think there's a real opportunity therefore to join up policy in this area around some of the principles that we've been talking about. I think the COVID pandemic showed us the importance of sustainable local food production and actually the demand for it as well. And I think government's role in supporting the sector to transition there from in all kind of ways, I guess, from a supply chain perspective, in terms of a government spend perspective, but also in terms of the perhaps upstream and downstream supply chain issues that I know the sector experiences at the moment in some regards. I think it's well worth looking at. And then if you think a bit about this more holistically, we were clear in the white paper that we want to maintain our high standards of food production. We want Wales to be renowned for the not just the standards of foods that it produces, but the sustainable credentials that it produces. And I think if to compete in a kind of global market around food, particularly in the context of the trade deals, we need to be demonstrating effectively our sustainability credentials. And I think there's a real opportunity, therefore, to not just maintain but enhance our credentials in that space, and to be marketing Welsh food as some of the most sustainably produced in the world. And I think there's a real opportunity and a kind of golden thread that we can run through from both food to farm there that I think would help brand Wales, if you like, to really market our food in that way.
There's a question here on the Welsh Government's tree planting targets. I'm sure you were expecting that from Mike Thomas. So yeah, how does the Welsh Government increasing tree cover kind of fit with the sustainable farming scheme, given that much of the planting needs to be done on sort of agricultural grazing land? And I'll just combine it with another question around sort of these large corporations that are buying farmland in Wales, potentially threatening Welsh language, biodiversity, rural communities, everything that the sustainable farming scheme sets out to protect. So your thoughts on that would be welcome.
Yeah, I think two responses to that. I mean, first of all, I think on the buying of agricultural land, government have already asked an expert group to look at that particular challenge, a woodland advisory panel to look at that. It was part of the Deputy Minister's deep dive into tree planting earlier, and asked the specific question about what levers, if you like, does government have to influence it. I think for me, from a sustainable farming perspective, I mean, we're really clear we want a holistic farm scheme. So it's a scheme that doesn't just say you can pick and choose woodland creation and turn the whole farm over to woodland. Actually, you have to do a range of holistic actions on the farm in order to be eligible for a payment, and that will be a range of actions which may well include woodland creation, but will include a range of other actions which support sustainable food production as well. So I think we can design a scheme in a way which does recognise the kind of approach that we want, which is we've talked about it before, being a land sharing approach, which is one where we don't see food production in competition, if you like, with the benefits of tree planting and woodland creation, but actually in harmony with it. Looking to plant the right tree in the right place doesn't necessarily mean turning over large swathes of very productive land to tree planting, but it can mean looking at opportunities to plant around hedges and edges, riparian buffer strips, expanding woodland creation, agroforestry options, for example. And I think the really heartening thing from my perspective in all that is, and I've talked quite a lot about evidence today, is the evidence base that will support that. And we do think that there's a real opportunity, I think, to meet the targets that we've set for tree planting, but alongside meeting those targets, to continue to produce high quality, sustainable food, and doing it in a way perhaps which is perhaps a little different to the Committee on Climate Change, which would recommend, which was perhaps a more intensive system of farming on less land and large swathes of land being turned over to tree planting. We think in Wales we need a different approach, and I think our land sharing approach really for us sets out how we're seeking to achieve it.
I'm glad to hear that you're adopting the land sharing approach. Question from Holly from the Land Workers Alliance about the sustainable farming scheme. Will payment for actions, will they be based on anticipated results, or will it be based on actual sort of given results or outcomes, bearing in mind that the latter might be sort of outside of the control the farmer. And I'll throw another one in there as well, around kind of lots of farmers at the moment I'm speaking to are reluctant to take advantage of funding to, for example, block drainage ditches on their peatland, because almost holding out for a more lucrative payment under the sustainable farming scheme. On our family farm, we're undertaking some works this winter to block ditches. Is there a guarantee that, you know, that the farmers that are taking action now won't be out of pocket for the work that they're delivering for nature now? Combine those two.
No, I think it's a good question. I mean, we've always said the scheme should reward maintenance as well as creation. So you know, where what we don't want farmers to do, particularly in the period between now and the introduction of the scheme, is do anything that would be detrimental they'd have to remedy, or to kind of avoid taking action now, which could be beneficial in the future. Because I think, you know, I'll go back to the point, what we're trying to do is derive a payment based on the outcome. Now, you know, that outcome in these instances could be restoration of peatland and the benefits of that, the environmental outcomes of that could demonstrate, such as carbon storage. And the payment will be based on that, whether you're maintaining it or creating it. So, you know, that's the kind of logic we're using. So I can understand why people may be holding off, but, you know, what we want to do is reward people who are for doing new things on their farm, but also maintaining the good practice that they're already undertaking. So that's an important point. On Holly's point, and it's a really good question, we're kind of conscious that not everything will be within a farmer's control. So if a farmer undertakes the actions that we've agreed as part of their plan, we would pay them for it. We know that things like weather and, you know, emissions and et cetera, you know, are you know, not entirely within you know, an individual farmer's control. So whilst the payment will be based on the outcomes, we would pay the farmer for the action. Or I should say the payment level will be based on the outcomes. We will pay the farmer for the actions if they've undertaken it in agreement, in accordance with the agreement we reached. So it's the former, Holly, if that makes sense.
We've got one question that hasn't been answered, and mindful of time, so I'll squeeze this one in. It's a question from Liz. How is the Welsh Government planning to respond to Westminster's rush to remove regulatory safeguards from GM techniques?
Yeah, so you know, we've always maintained, you know, as a government, the essential importance of maintaining our high standards of production and animal welfare. And I think in that, whilst we need to look at what the Westminster government are doing in relation to GM techniques, you know, those will be our overriding principles. So I'm not aware of the detail of the safeguards that Liz is referring to, I'm afraid, but if she did want to drop me a line, I could pick that up outside. But I think as a principle, that's what I'd probably respond to that by saying, you know, high standards of production and welfare, integral in terms of the lobbying that the Welsh Government is doing to the UK Government around trade deals, but also in terms of what we want to see in Wales in the future in terms of the standards of food produced.
We've used up our allotted half an hour, so thank you very much, James, for that, for the update of answering the questions. Two things I think are clear in my head from the kind of the questions that are being asked, that, you know, the importance that farmers are rewarded appropriately for delivering these sort of environmental benefits that governments want to see. And I think the other one is kind of marrying that with the need for a local food system. Both need to go sort of hand in hand, and almost you can't have one without the other, if that makes sense. And reducing the reliance that farmers have maybe on direct income support through a sustainable sort of food bill would go a long way, because it's a very uncertain time for farmers, and, you know, it's evidenced in the way that we are dependent on public funding, and big changes to that structure does lead to uncertainty for farmers. So thank you very much, James. Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr I pawb sydd wedi gyrru cwestiynau. Ac ia, dyna hi ddiwedd ar y sesiwn.
Diolch Rhys, diolch pawb.